Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with our second entry in our new series of classic film scores, mostly on Marco Polo and Chandos and other labels that let me use samples. So if any of you other people want me to talk about your film score, you got to let me use samples. Get in touch. Let me know what you've got. I'll be happy to work with you. Otherwise, take a hike. Anyway, today we are going to be talking about the first of many film scores by Bernard Herrmann, Jane Eyre. Yes, there she is, Jane Eyre, the Charlotte Bronte classic. Oh my goodness, it's so Charlotte. It's so Bronte. Were you forced to read this in high school English class? I was. Let me tell you, what an experience. We all know the story, don't we? Jane is an orphan who grows up in a miserable orphanage where she is trained to become a governess, and she gets shipped off to this creepy old house run by a guy named Rochester, who's always kind of standoffish. I mean, they always are in these English novels. They have this sort of cold formality, which turns out to be a facade for the most horrible, dysfunctional, psychotic, underlying, emotional turmoil that you can possibly imagine. But that is to come. She is to be the governess for his French adoptee. We're not quite sure why she's there, but she is. And while she's living there, she falls in love with Rochester. Rochester falls in love with Jane. But what Jane does not know is that Rochester is married. And his wife is insane, and he keeps her locked up in the attic. Yes, this is the source of the fabulous Mad Wife in the Attic stories, of which there were innumerable ones following. I love the Mad Wife in the Attic. In fact, she's my favorite character in the whole story. The best part is when Jane finally meets her, because she goes running around all night with a candle trying to burn the place down. And Jane keeps rescuing Rochester from having the place burned down, but she doesn't know who's doing it or why, although she's seen the ghostly figure wandering the hallway. And they're supposed to get married, and finally, like, their wedding day arrives, even though he's still married, and there's a crazy wife in the attic who Jane has not yet met, and who should show up but his brother-in-law at the wedding, naturally. Now, why is his wife crazy, and how do we know? Well, see, the Brontes and everybody in this period, the second half of the 19th century in Victorian England, they were into like phrenology. And they believed that, you wanted, if you had a high forehead, you were intelligent and noble. And the worst thing you could have, evidently, because Rochester's brother-in-law has this, is a weak chin. Because he had a weak chin, he was mentally imbalanced, and that's why Rochester's wife is crazy, you see. I really found this extremely puzzling when I was in high school reading this, because I could not get any idea of what the standard of masculine beauty or handsomeness was from these phrenological descriptions of these people with their weak chins and high foreheads. I finally, I have to say, I was really in despair over this until I found a contemporary edition that was illustrated, an actual illustrated edition of Jane Eyre that gave us a picture of the characters. And so I finally figured out what Rochester, with his manly brow and all that stuff, really looked like. And here's the picture. That's Rochester. And that's what a good-looking guy was for Victorian English people. Obviously. I really was quite surprised. Anyway, So, so Jane, of course, is quite miffed that he's already married and that his brother-in-law spills the beans, even though he has a weak chin. And so finally she gets to meet Gertrude, or whatever her name is, the crazy wife in the attic, And that is the best scene in the entire book because Rochester goes in there and she's this snarling animal who's chained to the bed. Somehow she has no problem getting out to burn the place down every night. But during the day, she's chained to the bed. I don't know how they manage that. And she attacks him and he grabs her and they have this fight scene. It's got to be like that, that fight scene between Burgess Meredith and Rachel Roberts, in Foul Play. It's just this insane banging and crashing, and he's whacking her head against the floorboards. And finally, he stomps and gets onto her and subdues her. And then he says, "Jane, this is my wife, Gertrude. Gertrude, please meet Jane." It's just amazing. So anyway, she runs away to take care of her sick and dying aunt, which leads me to question why she was an orphan in the first place. I mean, she has relatives. They wouldn't take her in. She's taking care of them now, but we're not going to go there. So eventually she's taking care of her dying aunt, and then the mad wife finally does manage to set fire to the whole place, and and Rochester nobly tries to save her, and he's blinded in the process, and so she comes back, and they get married, and he starts to recover his sight just in time to see her place his first child in his arms, and it all ends happily ever after. Gertrude's dead, of course. And if that was her name, the crazy wife, the one in the attic. So that's Jane Eyre. And it was a perfect story for Bernard Herrmann because he was a huge Anglophile, first of all. And second of all, he loved using like dark, low, gnarly, kind of gloomy, oppressive, atmospheric sound effect type noises with lots of low woodwinds and low strings. He uses a pretty conventional orchestra in this particular score, although it does have like an organ and a celesta and all the usual exotic Gucci's to make wonderful noises. This is his longest film score. It's about 68 minutes. It's quite splendidly restored and performed by Adriano, conducting the Slovak Radio Symphony Orchestra on Marco Polo. This was from 1943. It was an Orson Welles film. This is serious stuff. And Orson Welles also had a very high cranium. He was highbrowed. So he must have not had a weak chin. So he must not have been insane. Actually, he may have been insane. I don't think that phrenology stuff really worked at all. But the music here is wonderful, particularly that unbelievably evocative scene in the leper colony. It's just amazing. Oh, I'm sorry. There is no leper colony. Don't you wish there was? It would have been so much better if Jane had to go to a leper colony. She just has her aunt, who's kind of skeevy looking, actually, in the film. And she could have been a leper, but it doesn't matter. So I'm going to play you some samples so you get to enjoy this wonderful, dark, gloomy, sultry, brooding film score. Oh, and by the way, at the exact same time that Herrmann was doing this film score, he wrote his opera, Wuthering Heights, which is the other Bronte, Emily. And he used some of the music from this in Wuthering Heights because, you've heard one Bronte, you've heard them all, right? What difference does it make? They all sound the same. So let's start with the complete prelude, almost all of it, 2 minutes and a bit of it. It's really, really wonderfully, somehow English sounding because Herrmann knew his English stuff really well. But at the same time, more modern and spookier and darker. And it's just fantastic. Here is the prelude. And now we have to do some effects music. One of the cool things about Herrmann is that, he's basically in that prelude only using strings. But wow, I mean, what a tremendously atmospheric and gripping sound and texture he gets. He really was a master. And we all know that, I know. But every time I hear these scores, I just think, all over again, wow. I mean, there's a guy who's making sounds with conventional instruments that nobody did before, and it's just so marvelous. So one of the many fires that Gertrude sets, I think in the movie there's only one major one, well, two. The first one and then the one where she finally dies. So the first fire has some really good fire music. Not Wagnerian fire music at all, sort of modern crazy fire music. And here is The Fire. What I find cool about that fire music is how it manages to be fire music, but it still preserves the overall mood and kind of brooding darkness of the score as a whole. I mean, it's really quite masterful. And then my favorite cut, or one of my favorite cuts, I mean, there's a lot of them in here. There are in fact, 21 in all. I mean, it's a big piece, big score, is The Wedding. The wonderful, wonderful wedding that starts out with Jane happy as a clam and winds up with Jane not so happy. Not at all, because she's just found out that Rochester is really married because his weak-chinned brother-in-law has just told him, even though his chin is weak, he had the guts to speak up at the wedding. And the happiness drains out of the music quite abruptly and in the most terrifying possible way. It's just such elegant simplicity and cleverness in how this happens. So here is a bit of The Wedding. And if that hasn't sold you, nothing will. So once again, my friends, we're talking about Jane Eyre, the film score, 68 fun-filled minutes of English Victorian folderol, beautifully restored and conducted by Adriano at the head of the Slovak Radio Symphony Orchestra on Marco Polo. You're going to want to add this to your film music collection. I wouldn't recommend that you listen to it every day, or you may wind up with a weak chin also. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.